Good evening. My name is Avinom Pad. I'm the director of the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life at the University of Connecticut. And it is my distinct pleasure to welcome you here this evening for a very special program, Historic Firsts, a conversation on the Georgia Senate victories. And in a moment, we'll talk a little bit more about why we thought it was so important to organize this program for this evening. I want to thank our wonderful co-sponsors who helped to make this program possible this evening, specifically the UConn African American Cultural Center, the UConn Philosophy Department, the Center for Judaic Studies and Contemporary Jewish Life, UConn Hillel, and the undergraduate student government. So thank you to all of our wonderful co-sponsors who helped to make this program possible this evening. We are so excited to have a distinguished panel of speakers and commentators to tell us a little bit more about the significance of the Georgia Senate victories, which, as we know, and as I know my colleagues will address, have sort of been overshadowed by other events that happened the week of January 5th and January 6th, which continue to dominate our focus. And so we are glad to bring some of the attention back to what was such a significant historic event in and of itself. The program is going to consist of remarks by our distinguished speakers, Dr. Evelyn Simien and Lindy Miller, who I will introduce in a moment, as well as commentary from my wonderful colleagues at the University of Connecticut, Professors Jane Gordon and Lewis Gordon. Dr. Evelyn Simien was professor of political science and director of the Indigeneity, Race, Ethnicity, and Politics Master's Degree Program at UConn. She received her PhD from Purdue University and specializes in African American politics, public opinion, and political behavior. She's the author of Historic Firsts, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes US Politics. And thank you to Dr. Simien for allowing us to borrow from the title of your wonderful book for the title of this program on Historic Firsts. Lindy Miller is a Georgia native who has 2 decades of public policy and corporate strategy experience. In 2016, she co-founded Cherry Street Energy, a renewable energy company that has transformed Georgia's energy marketplace. She then jumped into the political arena as a statewide candidate in Georgia's 2018 midterm elections and currently serves as a strategic advisor to her term and co-founded Georgia Onward PAC in 2020. My colleagues, Jane Gordon and Lewis Gordon, will both serve as moderators and commentators for this program this evening. Jane Anna Gordon is professor of political science at the University of Connecticut with affiliations in American Studies, El Instituto, Global Affairs, Philosophy, and Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies. And she's the author most recently of Statelessness and Contemporary Enslavement, as well as Creolizing Political Theory, Reading Rousseau through Frantz Fanon. Lewis Gordon is professor and department head at UConn Philosophy and has published widely, as I'm sure many of you know, approximately 100 articles, book chapters, and reviews, including What Fanon Said, a philosophical introduction to his life and thought, Of Divine Warning, Reading Disaster in the Modern Age, an introduction to Africana philosophy, and more. So it is a distinct pleasure to welcome such a distinguished panel. In a moment, I'm going to turn it over to Lewis Gordon for some introductory remarks. I'll just point out that as our speakers are speaking this evening, we would encourage all of you as you're thinking, if you have questions, to use the chat function at the bottom of your screen. And we'll have time at the end of everyone's remarks to have a moderated Q&A, and it would be best if you type your questions into the chat, and this way we'll be able to get to as many questions as possible. So I'm very happy to turn the screen over to Professor Lewis Gordon.
Thank you, Javi. Thank you. To all of you, Laila Tov, good evening, Shalom, and Assalamu alaikum. And in addition to that, as a Jew-Macon, I will also say, I hope you're all keeping well. Right now, we already know we're dealing with all kinds of upheavals. as we think of what's going on in the Senate. And also when we think about the storming of the Capitol, where as we look at what unfolded at the Capitol building, we realize it's even far more horrific than we imagined. And in the midst of it, as we know, over time, there will be people who look at the historicality of the moment, but there are things, unfortunately, some people might overlook. And it's important for those of us who look at the long view, the larger picture, to commemorate those who may be either forgotten or, as we say, overlooked. And some of this, as we know, is connected to some of the attacks, not only in the Obama administration, which is an effort to turn the clock back in terms of what happened to the Trump administration on Reconstruction. But there's also the fact that right now, there are some of us who may try to look for immediate understandings when there are those who look at that larger picture. And there are these wonderful moments when we see people who proverbially got it right. And among them is someone like my colleague, Evelyn Simien, with her wonderful book, Historic Firsts. Because you see, a lot of people miss the point when we talk about it, historic firsts. It's not necessarily the people whom we identify as the so-called winners. But as we know, in the events that are happening right now, the efforts of Stacey Abrams enabled a lot of us to realize that her efforts set the conditions for things that made for a lot of us, especially when we look at the Senate, saying, wow, we dodged a bullet. And so I'm not going to prolong what I have to say because Evelyn could speak for herself, but there are many historic firsts here. And we know it's connected to the community. It's connected to not only Ossoff and Warnock, it's connected to Stacey Abrams and those who preceded her, all the way back through to those brave souls who stood up against forces of dehumanization, degradation, the fight against freedom, because right now we're all meeting in an historic effort to meet together for democracy. And so without further ado, I now pass it on to my colleague, Dr. Professor, I do it German style, Dr. Professor Evelyn Simien.
Well, thank you for those kind words, Louis. And thank you to everyone who is here this evening to participate in the conversation. And I do foresee this as a dialogue, a conversation. I would add to all the organizers, the people from the first person that has created the flyer to all the promotion surrounding this event tonight. I thank you, I thank you, I thank you. It is an opportunity to sort of reflect upon, in some ways, I still feed off of the questions and continue to evolve in my thinking about this construct, symbolic empowerment. So I will start off with framing sort of the conversation around the original text, which, I got a copy of it here, Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes US Politics. It was published in 2015 by Oxford University Press. And I'm currently working on an edited volume, which soon will be delivered to Cambridge University Press to be sent out for external review, because I'm constantly asked questions about, well, what about this congressional case, this gubernatorial race, and this mayoral campaign? So I see this edited volume as actually a sequel to the first monograph. And it's titled Historic First in US Elections, Gubernatorial, Congressional, and Mayoral Campaigns. And so there are several case studies within the text that then adapt my construct, my theoretical framework of symbolic empowerment to that specific race. But I'm still asked time and time again about so many races. I can't keep up with every single historic first. I think it's either 2018 or 2019 that was dubbed the year of the Black woman mayor. And there were probably over 10 Black women that were elected to a number of major cities. In my home state of Louisiana, there were 3 African-American women elected as mayor to the largest cities in the state of Louisiana: Baton Rouge, New Orleans. I think it was Shreveport, the third. And so I'll begin by talking about the 2015 text and that central organizing concept as sort of a segue. And what I like about Lindy's presence is if anyone can make it concrete and sort of very practical, I would think it's her, given the Georgia context and the Senate runoff elections and the mobilizing effect of those 2 historic firsts in a deep South state, you know, the heart of the Confederacy. So without further ado, I do have some typed up remarks that I'll share with you. So in Historic First, How Symbolic Empowerment Changes US Politics, I argued that the historic entry of presidential hopefuls from Shirley Chisholm, Jesse Jackson, Hillary Clinton, and Barack Obama changed the nature of American presidential elections as we know it. At the heart of this book was this central organizing concept, symbolic empowerment, that suggests historic first matter insofar as they effectively mobilize new segments of the American electorate. The moment in which a historic first candidate enters the electoral arena and the campaign ensues is described in terms of contextual effects that are what I call symbolically empowering. The presence of a historic first who mirrors a marginalized group pictorially signals what we believe to be greater access or progress in terms of electoral opportunities, and then motivates political behavior from the kind of voters that political analysts previously had written off, who we describe as on the periphery of American politics, looking in, if they're looking at politics at all. So I asked the question, did the historic candidacies of Chisholm, Jackson, Clinton, and Obama change the levels of political engagement for racial, ethnic, and gender groups? While I examined whether the changing face of American presidential politics boosts the premium that individuals assign to voting and other political behaviors like canvassing, donating money, or putting a bumper sticker on your car or putting a sign in your lawn, I also employed readers to consider the ways in which unconventional white candidates like Hillary Clinton used their gender and their race to serve as a catalyst for white Americans to also equally exercise their right to vote. And so this has caused a lot of folks to sort of take my concept and think about it in relationship to Donald Trump's own presidency. So I would say, once you have this construct, it's like the train has left the station and everybody's kind of applying it in their own sort of way. And in more recent time, I've had people talk about this construct in the following way that I'm going to describe when it comes to Donald Trump. So both the shadow of Donald Trump's wildly unconventional US presidency and the recent 2020 American presidential election loom over this otherwise groundbreaking analysis as we reflect on Trump's efforts to target and incorporate a group of motivated, previously non-participatory white citizens with low information, misstatements, and distortions. They who saw themselves as marginalized and looking for a symbolic candidate outside of the mainstream Washington establishment to empower and alter their political behaviors could be described in similar terms as supporters of previously marginalized symbolic candidates like Chisholm and Jackson, even as their privileged racial status, read white, overshadows their lower socioeconomic class. The American presidential election of 2016 and what some have called the Trump effect, founded on making America great again, or bringing back the glory days of America, has proven instructive. As we consider the mobilizing effect of such a ready symbol that made the routine election controversial on account of his hate messaging, racist rhetoric, and emotion-satisfying gestures, Trump's flamboyant style and dramatic oratory resembled oftentimes a staged performance that conformed to his public persona as what we call an extreme personality, which elicited, as we saw, standing ovations and enthusiastic applause from captive audiences at large public rallies, or what we call super spreader events in light of the pandemic. Over time, Trump, though, benefited from a shift in perception regarding his viability as a Republican presidential candidate and the spectacle of his 2016 campaign, which was interpreted as actively symbolic by several political analysts at the time, who expressed disbelief and raised doubts about his long-term success. While he had no legacy of public service for which to cement his representational ties and affirm his leadership on the main stage of the Republican Party apparatus, he still stood before us as a member of the business elite, a real estate developer, and a reality television actor, best known for what those words, "You're fired," on The Apprentice. At the same time, and no less importantly, there is perhaps no political office where traditional racial and gender stereotypes worked more to his advantage than a US presidency. Arguably the manliest of all elected offices, the default identity category for the American president has always been that of a white male. On this basis, Trump could be viewed as the best suited for the role of commander-in-chief of the military, overseer of the economy, the country's foremost diplomat in 2016, as opposed to his then Democratic opponent, Hillary Clinton. Because what it means to be a woman in the United States does not correspond well with gendered expectations of what it means to be a president. So both the way he was presenting the media voluntarily as a function of his campaign performance and involuntarily as a function of political commentary contributed to his role as an iconoclastic candidate. Whether such candidates achieve group solidarity on this basis remains a hugely important and timely question today. Given Trump's recent loss of his second term as president of the United States, the role in which Black voters played in determining the outcome of the 2020 American presidential election, as they were the margin of victory in such battleground states as Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Georgia. Once Trump had taken the oath of office and emerged as incumbent, the empowering effect of being a historic first, that being in this case a Washington outsider with no prior experience as either an office holder or candidate running for political office, had worn off. Republican voters were not nearly as inspired or effectively mobilized by his second campaign, as he often interjected himself in those local contests, appearing at numerous rallies for House, Senate, and gubernatorial candidates, where he called attention to himself, in effect making himself and his presidency a campaign issue. In many districts and statewide contests, the Democratic candidates then ran against the president, overtly or more subtly, to mobilize their side and capitalize on what they viewed as negative voter sentiment toward him, resulting in presidential referendum effects that made a difference in determining the balance of power between the two major parties in the US House and Senate, which brings us to the Georgia contest, which we discussed tonight, right? As I've argued elsewhere, it's the higher rate at which African-American votes, I should say African-Americans vote, and African-American women especially, is vitally important. As I've argued in a 2020 article, you know, the title of that article is, Do Black Votes Count? You know, do they really matter? When we attempt to understand the effect, the mobilizing effect of historic first and their consequences for the following: the 2018 United States congressional midterm elections, the 2020 American presidential election, and the 2020 United States Senate elections, especially the runoffs in Georgia. Now more than ever, research on the mobilization of American voters generally and African-American voters specifically is relevant to our discussion about electoral outcomes and political representation. And so the potential for symbolic empowerment to have relevance today across electoral office and constituent group merits our scholarly attention. It is not simply a question of whether or not presidential approval ratings or they as individual candidates bolster political behavior as historic first, but the larger question is whether their office seeking stimulates active participation in the selection process. The goal is to provide a more comprehensive study of American political behavior with support for historic first, serving as yet another explanatory variable alongside the usual factors or variables like class and previous sort of voter turnout records, campaign strategy, the quote unquote constituent base, the geographic space, spending, fundraising patterns, etc. But it forces us to consider the significance behind the historic nature of the contest and how that resonates with an American public that previously were sort of uninvolved, disinterested, and now they are all in, fully engaged, and actively mobilized. So I haven't timed myself. I don't know where I'm at in timing, but I think that's perhaps a good place to stop.
Thank you, Evelyn. Lindy, we turn to you.
Well, it's hard to follow that. I am not a scholar. I am married to a scholar, so I know I'm really not a scholar. But I am a student of like the real world and seeing what's gone on in Georgia. I was born and raised here, and it's interesting, Evelyn, to hear, you know, the way that you've described what it is that we've seen over the course of, I guess, the last 50 years, really, in terms of the emergence of these historic firsts. And what strikes me is, you know, I'm an economist by training, so I think about a lot of things in terms of supply and demand. And I think we've had, you know, problems kind of on both sides of that market, if you will, in politics. And I can only speak about Georgia. What I found very interesting, maybe some of you saw it this afternoon, Stacey Abrams and Lauren Groh-Wargo, who was her campaign manager and also is the CEO of Fair Fight Action, the PAC that Stacey started, wrote an op-ed this afternoon in the New York Times, and it's called How to Turn Your Red State Blue. And the subtitle is, It May Take 10 Years, Do It Anyway. And the only thing I would say to that, to add to this, and this article or this op-ed is phenomenal, you should read it because it talks about lots of dimensions of what has occurred and really what Stacy drove with others around the state over the last decade, is I would say it's not, I would argue with the fact it may take 10 years. I think it takes a lot longer than 10 years. And it's very hard in my mind to distinguish the chicken from the egg, that these things build on one another, that we have legacies of organizing with the NAACP or HBCUs here, or, you know, all of the different networks and fabric of women across the state, particularly Black women and women of color. And, you know, that to me kind of on the demand side, on the voter side, with the complementary, you know, emergence of candidates over the last 10 or 20 years, which took a very long time to build. You know, someone like Stacy, who looked for a legislative seat that she could win and move to a seat where she knew the woman was going to retire and she could run for that seat to get into the Georgia legislature, with a long plan of working her way up through the ticket, because she always says, you know, the lower down you are on the ballot, the closer you are to home, that she worked her way up. We see that among candidates all across the state. We have, you know, the first gay Korean candidate who won in Gwinnett County a legislative seat in 2016, I believe. We have the first Vietnamese American woman who won Stacy's seat in a special election in 2017. We have the first lesbian Black senator, state senator, serving in Georgia this year, Kim Jackson, who just won her seat. And so we have the emergence of these candidates. And the reason I point that out is because it's hard to know whether, you know, a young Korean man running for a seat in a district with a large Korean community is actually inspiring Korean voters, or running because he is inspired because there are more Korean voters that he can mobilize. And I think it's a very interesting question as to like kind of what comes first. But what Stacy and Lauren point out in their very extensive explanation in their op-ed is that having a systemic, holistic, long-term plan where you're acknowledging the role of all of these different factors, changing demographics, the need to support candidates at every level of government, the need to build campaign infrastructure, the need to have diverse organizing teams, and not just diverse teams that, like, if I'm Asian or Latinx and I'm talking to my own community, I'm actually doing fundraising, I'm doing the work inside the campaigns, and we're training that generation of campaign staff who will eventually represent and become that representative democracy for the people that they're interacting with through the course of their organizing and their mobilizing. That we are building a stronger state party whereby all of these things can be coordinated, where we are actually talking to human beings, voters and non-voters, to understand what issues they care about, and not just fighting what Republicans are saying, but actually having a message that speaks to people that they can get behind and will give them a reason to turn out and vote. And I should say I am a Democrat. I ran as a Democrat, so I am speaking as a Democrat here, but I think it goes for politics more broadly. And I think the Democratic Party is clearly doing this very well. So I've known John for a long time, I've known Raphael for a long time, and kind of seeing them emerge as our senators, I keep saying Senate candidates, but as our senators, you know, it is hard to disentangle. Is it, for me, you know, as Evelyn's pointing out, the historic first of, you know, seeing a Black man and a Jewish man winning the Senate seats in Georgia, or is it a natural consequence of the build that has been occurring purposefully through historic firsts that were maybe not so visible to the average voter, that we're building over time? The extensive Black-Jewish relations that have existed and partnerships that have existed through civil society, through politics, through the business community here in Georgia over the last, as long as folks have been working together here, certainly since the civil rights movement, but before that as well. So, it's interesting as well to note John never hid being Jewish, but he never ran as a Jewish candidate in the same way that it was self-evident that Raphael was a Black candidate. And, so I question some of these identity issues, what is historic to the average voter? And at the end, I think the message and the ability to connect with voters and having, when I ran for office and people would say, well, can you win statewide? You're a Democrat. I'd say, if you don't run, you can't win. And if you don't run, the next person can't win. And I think that's such a critical thing to remember, that if Stacey didn't run and inspire the people that she inspired through the course of her race, of every color of the rainbow, and particularly mobilizing Black women and women of color in Georgia, who were already the most active Democratic voters in this state, I don't think Warnock would have won and John wouldn't have stood a chance. That everyone is standing on the shoulders of those who came before. What I didn't realize, because I had been in business a long time and then came into politics, what I didn't realize until after my race was kind of the importance of all of the in-between. So there are these names that maybe some people know, but most people don't, like Nsé Ufot, who's the head of the New Georgia Project, which was founded by Stacey, and Nsé came in. She's a Nigerian American woman who is a phenomenal political strategist, organizing strategist, mobilizing strategist. And New Georgia Project registered 2 million voters, 800,000 voters, and they knocked on 2 million doors between 2018 and 2020. Because their premise is you don't just talk to voters when you've got a great candidate, you talk to voters throughout their lives, not just cyclically, but you go and you listen to what it is that people want. And you go and you listen to what issues, will move people. And that takes an average of 4 conversations at someone's door. And the work of New Georgia Project, the work of Black Voters Matter, the work of Georgia Conservation Voters, the work of NAACP, of the People's Agenda. There are all of these organizations that have been working big and small, and not just organizations, people. I can name dozens of activists who I would think about as having their own influence circles, who have mobilized people to go vote. And I think, when I ran for office, most of my donors were not political donors. They were people that I knew, who I got excited, and then they voted in a primary, which they had never done before. So, these individuals, there are, if I know dozens or hundreds, there are tens of thousands across their state who have their circles. And those folks got inspired, and those folks plugged in, and they started their own things, the postcard projects and all the things that you might have read about that happen. So I'm happy to, I think we should open it up for questions, because I'd love to hear what people are thinking about. And Evelyn will tackle all of the heady scholarly stuff that she knows well. And I'd be happy to answer any kind of on the ground questions and have a discussion. Thank you so much for organizing this, to my cousins, and also to all of the sponsors tonight.
Thank you, Lindy. We have one more political scientist who would like to make a brief remark, and it turns out to be Jane Anna Gordon. So Jane Anna Gordon,
sure.
The screen is yours.
The screen is mine. I'm going to be very brief. And although it's kind of rolling things back slightly, I'm just going to say again how wonderful it is to be with Evelyn Simien, who's my treasured colleague and partner in crime, and my cousin Lindy, who I haven't seen for almost a decade. And hey, one of her sons is there too. Hello. One of the things for me that's so special about seeing Lindy, especially in this context, is we're both South African Jews. We don't have many family actually in the United States. And it's just interesting to think together about how we carry the sort of obligations that come with that identity forward in this context. And so I'm especially thankful that she's here with us. And it's great to see members of the Havara, Susan, Faith, Marcia, and Mary. It's lovely to see you here. Thank you for being here. And I think all I really wanted to add were just a couple minor things. which is that there's a really powerful way in which Evelyn and Lindy's work, not just what they've said today, but their work more generally really connects. Which is, and Lewis loves to cite Evelyn on this point, and I think he's so right to do so, which is that there's a tendency to think about political failure in a really impoverished sense, right? That if you don't win enough votes, you've somehow failed. And one of the points that Evelyn's work makes, and that Lindy was just referring to, is that so much of setting the ground, preparing the ground for these kinds of beautiful things to emerge is what in the short term may seem like failures. And yet they stand as sort of signals of possibility for folks to emerge and come forward. It's exactly what Lindy said, you can't win if you don't run. And I think about, you know, what being able to teach about Shirley Chisholm means for a lot of people, or Jesse Jackson or Hillary Clinton, and just what those figures mean for the ability to imagine certain kinds of futures. And I was thinking, Lindy, when you were talking about the personal, you know, I mean, I remember so distinctly, you know, the first time Barack Obama was on a stage and sang Al Green, that I just never thought in a million years that somebody who occupied the White House would feel moved in that way, right? Or I was thinking about how at Inauguration Day, the way that Bernie's mittens struck this just resonant chord through the nation. And what it is for a lot of young people, and especially, I mean, I would say this as a not so young Jewish person, what it is for there to be a Jew in electoral politics who's not corporate. Because for me, I mean, Judaism and socialism have always been intertwined messages and projects and commitments. And so to see somebody like Bernie saying what he does and seeing young people who sort of get alighted by a politics that they can actually connect with. I mean, that doesn't feel like you have to compromise and sacrifice to connect to it. And so when Evelyn, when you were talking about all in, I was thinking about what it is that enables people to just invest existentially and to really feel that it's a place in which they can see themselves. And then just the last thing I wanted to say was, I don't particularly like the formulation Blacks and Jews because it makes it seem like most Jews look like me and Lindy and all Blacks are Christians. And so it does as much obscuring as it does illuminating. But I have to say, one of the things about Warnock and Ossoff that I did find really moving in terms of sort of how people connected to them and their victories is that they're really about trying to continue the project of enfranchisement, right? I mean, what they're part of the answer of how you turn Georgia blue is you actually enfranchise Americans who've been systematically disenfranchised through all kinds of different legal and illicit means. And so there's just something so powerful about that alliance really being about bringing this country into its present and future instead of using violence to stick it in a mythic past. And so there, for me, I mean, in the midst of that, the violent, taking over of the Capitol Hill, to have it, the day begin and end with those victories was really, really poignant because it really encapsulates where we are as a country. At the beginning and the end was about trying to build a future together. And in the middle was all of the violence it takes to try to stop that project in its tracks. And so I would just again say thank you so much, Evelyn and Lindy, for being here with us. And it'd be great to open things up to questions.
Thank you, Professor Gordon.
You're welcome, Professor Gordon.
So right now, would members of the audience, it would be wonderful to hear from you. So you could, if you'd like, if you're not familiar with this forum, there's a little button that says reactions. And if you click it, it can say raise your hand. But I think we have a community here if you'd like. You could just actually raise your hand. And it's fine, it doesn't have to be even a question, it could be a comment. Because what we've heard as a common thread is that we're all, this community, even if you look at the screen right now, of all of us who are here, there are people who have said repeatedly in the history of this country that it's a white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant country. And at the end of the day, that view with a Confederate flag waving, it would say, never Georgia, never Louisiana, never South Carolina, never Alabama. But at the moment, we do have an historic first in which a lot of people can pause and say, why not? because ultimately we all belong here, and we all are right now stepping forth for the enfranchisement of the people of this country so we can have genuine democracy. So I'm looking forward to hearing from all of you. Welcome, my fellow people, in this effort of democracy. Oh, I see a hand. Go ahead, Arnold Greenberg. You just have to unmute.
Yes. Thank you. I'm from Connecticut. I'm obviously not from Georgia. I'm not even on the waiting list yet. I'm very much interested in the relationship of John to the Jewish community. And I suppose my first question is, how large are the various Jewish communities of Georgia? Are they politically active? Were they active for John? Did they make a difference?
So the Jewish community here, we don't have exact numbers because it's difficult to fully account, but somewhere between 150 to 190,000 people. And that maybe 200,000 statewide. John's relationship in the Jewish community, he had his bar mitzvah at the temple, which is an historic community here in Georgia, and the Bible that he was sworn in on actually belonged to one of the rabbis of the temple, one of the past rabbis. He is, I don't know how active he would say he is in the Jewish community, but that's what I do know. The Jewish community is extremely politically, participates at a very high rate, as the Jewish community does across the country. I mean, the experts here in the room would know better. And for the most part, the Jewish community here is also still voting at very high rates as Democrats. We don't know in Georgia, again, because you don't register as a Democrat or a Republican in Georgia. You do have to vote in a Democrat or Republican primary, but when you go to vote, you can select which ballot you want to pull. So we actually we're not able to identify necessarily how many Republicans and how many Democrats we are, and we can't cross-tabulate that with voters. But I would say the rates here are estimated to be around 75 to 80% Democrat voters. There are very, very strong organizing groups. We have the National Council of Jewish Women. We have a group called the Jewish Democratic Women's Salon. There are all sorts of groups that are organizing. They were working for Democrats. I wouldn't say they were working necessarily for John from the beginning, but there is a very strong feeling here that when someone loses a primary, everyone is behind the candidate who does win. And I think that was well evidenced when Stacey won her primary against Stacey Evans. The next day, there was a lunch held by the Emily's List affiliate here, and Stacey Evans showed up in honor of Stacey Abrams. So there is definitely a culture of getting behind whoever the winner is, and the Jewish community did that with John. To the extent that John ran his congressional race in 2017, actually in the district that I was raised in, the 6th congressional district, has a very high proportion of Jewish residents and Jewish voters. So folks were already very familiar with John from the Jewish community who lived in that area. And because he grew up in the temple and had been, his friends and his wife's family and everyone were Jewish, he definitely had a lot of Jewish support from his first race as well.
I could
I'm sorry. No, go ahead, Jane. And Arnold, you just have to unmute after Jane finishes.
I was just gonna add to what Lindy had said, that one of the things that's unique about, I mean, this is, when people say this, they always assume that Jews are white and primarily European. But when people have studied Jews in that way, one of the things that's unique about Jews as a white ethnic group is that as the community has become more affluent, it has remained much more democratic than is true of other white ethnic groups. And so the percentage that Lindy cited is the percentage nationally. What's very distinct, though, is that the Jews who are conservative and neoconservative, while small in number, are incredibly vociferous. So they seem much more numerous than they actually are. And the other thing I would just add to what Lindy had said in terms of national patterns is that Jewish women are much more actively politically than Jewish men. I mean, both are active, but it's a lot like with the Black community, that Jewish women are yet more so, and that's been true for as long as there have been Jews in this country.
And I would say also, in terms of statewide candidates, you know, I think if I had been elected, I would have been the second Jew to win statewide. So John is only the second Jew to win statewide in Georgia ever, and maybe only the third or fourth to run. And I have to say, when I decided to run, one of the real questions we had to answer was, how would we feel if, like, our white brick house had a swastika, you know, painted on it, or my kids with Hebrew names, or my husband, who is a rabbi but a professor at Emory, you know, would we be vilified for these things? And interestingly, on the campaign trail, when talking to groups, now mostly Democratic groups, you know, although in certain areas, there's a lot of anti-Semitism still within Democratic groups in Georgia, although you wouldn't necessarily, in the same way that we might see racism among Democratic groups as well, or we do see that. You know, people were very receptive in the South. You know, if you're a person of the book, it almost doesn't matter how you got there, or which avenue you took. If you're a religious, you know, Jew, or a religious Christian, or, you know, even a religious Muslim, if you are by your book, there is a respect. Sure. And I will say there's something that is interesting. There has been a lot of discussion. I'd be interested to hear from others. You know, Reverend Warnock, the Black candidates who have traditionally done very well statewide in the South have a strong religious identity that they are not ashamed to share. And in fact, that is said to inspire a lot of folks here. So I'd be interested in hearing more when we talk about historic firsts. You know, it is not unusual to have Black candidates with that kind of background. And Stacy would talk about her parents, who were both ministers, not necessarily about her own Christian identity, but the storytelling always encapsulated some kind of religious story. So I'm curious to hear whether that's, Evelyn, something that you've noticed as well when you look at Southern races.
Go home. If he had done that immediately, this wouldn't have happened.
I can say
to mute so that we can make sure we hear Evelyn.
My mind was going to sort of the literature that we know that. So ironically, the professor is at Georgia State, who actually is Calhoun is the last name. Gosh, her name, it escapes me, but I know it's hyphenated. And the work on religion and politics does focus disproportionately on African-American voters and what's the impact of sort of religiosity in determining their active participation in politics. And for the longest time, because I do survey research, the surveys would ask their respondents, you know, how frequently they went to church. Was it, you know, weekly? Was it once a month? Was it on those select holidays that you showed up? And there was this correlation, there was this relationship between church attendance and voting in elections. But it is Calhoun Brown, that's her last name. And she's at Georgia, she's an associate professor at Georgia State in the political science department, who came along and said, you know, it's not church attendance, it's the type of church. Is it a politicized Black church? And I grew up in a politicized Black church. Now, being in Louisiana, it was a Black Catholic church. And to attend a politicized Black church is to hear your pastor, or in my case, the priest, tell you, you need to vote. And kind of tongue in cheek, they won't tell you who to vote for, but you know they're supporting Obama's candidacy, or you know who they're endorsing without them sort of outright naming the person, right? And sometimes they're not shameless or apologetic about it. In other instances, you know, I grew up where the local politician was invited to church, and that person stood up and was recognized and had a few minutes to like pitch his candidacy before the congregation.
Oh, we did that.
And so what we learned is that it's not simply church attendance. It was the type of church. And so, you know, African Americans are very church-going people, right? But we also are attending politicized churches where, you know, we know in Ohio, there were these buses that were chartered and sponsored by church groups that took the membership, the congregation, to the polls. I think it was like called the mantra or slogan was like taking souls to the polls.
Souls to the polls, or they call it pews to the polls also.
Yeah. And so to answer your question, that is sort of the context in which, you know, political scientists sort of study political behavior in relationship to religiosity and sort of public opinion and our attitudes toward politics and even civil rights and women's roles. I could say so much. I could say more even on that, but I'll pause there.
Okay.
That's typically how we study religiosity and sort of political behavior.
Yeah, I see Mary Williams' hands up. Oh, so go ahead. You just have to unmute.
Yes.
And
Hi.
Howard.
And Howard. Mary and Howard.
Hi.
Yeah.
For everybody that doesn't know me, I'm Howard Hahn. I'm married to Mary Williams. And I had a question. I just want to say that I am a liberal Democrat. I was very, very happy to hear about the runoff election, and very big supporter of Reverend Warnock and John Ossoff. If I was down in Georgia, I would have voted for both of them. I was very happy that they were elected. But my question is that during the campaign, I was very, by the way, I was very impressed with Reverend Warnock when he preached at John Lewis's funeral. And I really liked the guy a lot. I was very disturbed during the campaign by reports that I had seen, whether or not they were true, that at some point Reverend Warnock was preaching anti-Semitic sermons. And I was disturbed by that. And I was just wondering if that was a Republican attempt at sabotaging the Jewish vote in Atlanta, or in whatever the county was where that vote was. And I just wanted to know if there was, anybody that had any comments about that, if anybody else had heard that. I find it very hard to believe, I don't know him, but, knowing what I know about him and how I've seen him interact with communities, and the way he was preaching at John Lewis's funeral, I find it very, very hard to believe that he would be preaching anything anti-Semitic. So just looking for any commentary on that, if anybody had heard anything about that.
Thank you, Howard.
Yeah, so there's actually a lot of documentation about this. I know The Forward did a number of articles about this. Yeah. You can Google this. In my understanding and my opinion about what transpired, Kelly Loeffler and David Perdue were on the defense throughout the course of their campaign. And they did everything they could to craft racist and divisive undertones, just like Trump did. They took a page out of his book and they selected tiny elements of things that Reverend Warnock might have spoken about in a sermon or in passing. And he acknowledged some of the things that he had talked about. But Loeffler took these tiny nothings and created a massive wedge issue, which in my opinion was itself an anti-Semitic act, trying to other the Jewish community to say, look at him, you people should not vote for him, which itself we could talk for days and days about. Deborah Lipstadt, who is a very well-known academic, maybe the preeminent academic on anti-Semitism, actually wrote an article regarding her support of Reverend Warnock and why she was supporting him, which really was out on a limb for her to come out politically. And you can look for her article as well to answer some of these questions.
Okay, thank you. We have some commentary in the chat while some others think of their question. We have enough time to go till 8:30. So one was from our moderator, from Avi. He said, I'm curious about the changing demographics and the urban-rural divide. How much does this divide hold up even in the most recent elections? Is Georgia changing, or are Georgia's large cities and suburbs changing? And related to that, Jane had written, and I wonder with COVID, how exoduses out of cities will affect urban-rural voting patterns. And Margaret Malmborg wrote, and is Georgia's population younger and doing better economically? And I think we could stop from there. I put them out while others think of their questions.
So in terms of the rural-urban divide, it's very hard to look at the runoff and make any categorical statement because a lot of things happen during the runoff that we really don't understand how to isolate. Trump's voter suppression, his effective voter suppression, telling Republicans not to trust the election system, really, really depressed Republican turnout in heavy red areas around the state, which wouldn't matter in a regular election, but do matter when you're talking about a statewide election, where every vote kind of matters. And you get this depression of anywhere between 5 to 15% of Republican voters, plus a huge swell in Democratic voting. We actually don't know exactly how to answer that question yet, but I will say demographically, while we may not know the impact in terms of Democrats and Republicans in rural areas, and I do believe there are a lot of Democrats in rural areas who most statewide candidates have ignored to their peril and not given folks a reason to turn out to vote, which is why we don't know how many Democrats there necessarily are in rural areas and why we support House races, I mean, Georgia House legislative races now more than ever in a lot of these rural areas, so that someone is door knocking in a rural district to not only encourage voters to turn out for their race, but of course to encourage them to turn out for a statewide race. So the more folks you have running at every level who identify as Democrats, the more we will see folks come out of the woodwork. I think we also have a lot of Black, Latinx, Asian American voters, Native American voters in all of these rural areas also who have been ignored and have not been directly spoken with in historic elections. And so we saw a shift in that as well in this election. And I say that just to say, the divide exists. It definitely is more red the more rural you are. But I think we find these purple pockets when we actually make an effort not to ignore areas because we think they're red, if that makes sense. The urbanization trend here is tremendous. I think you will maybe remember for the runoff, DeKalb County was the county everyone was waiting for. And I live in DeKalb County. And there was a joke going that DeKalb County was holding out until the rest of America understood that the L was not pronounced in DeKalb County. It's not DeKalb County, but DeKalb County. And the reason that's become so important is because we've had a huge migration to Atlanta. And, you know, likewise in other cities, Columbus, Albany, you know, Savannah, Augusta, we have folks moving into cities in the same way that we do everywhere else. So that we currently have in a Democratic primary, about 65 to 70% of our votes come from Atlanta in a Democratic primary. In terms of the suburban areas, what we have seen as well is a slow turning. If Atlanta was blue like this, slowly, we see folks like Lucy McBath turning a seat. We saw Carolyn Bordeaux flip a seat in the Georgia 7th this year. And we see a lot of that is actually preceded by Georgia legislative races that get won, not at the federal level, but at the state level, where we slowly see people flipping seats so that Sam Park, the young Korean American man who won in Gwinnett County, won 4 years before Carolyn Bordeaux won her seat in Gwinnett County, and she overlaps his district. So these tiny turns that we see eventually create a larger puzzle in the overall district. Unfortunately, and this is something that we'll have to watch in 22, we actually did not make the gains in the suburban areas that we thought we would. I have my own theories about Joe Biden as a candidate versus what Stacey Abrams was like as a candidate, what it means to be 4 years after Trump's first election versus 2 years after Trump's first election for some of these House races. But actually, you know, we were working very hard to try and gain 16 seats in the legislature, and we gained in the low single digits.
Evelyn, do you want to add to that? I'm looking at some of the additional statements here.
Let me let me get caught up on these.
Yeah, and in the meantime, I see also that there is Angie Beeman from Baruch College here. Hello.
Student of mine, by the way.
Yes.
I was a student of Evelyn's when I was a graduate student at UConn.
Well, welcome.
To see her speak.
Mm-hmm.
Oh, thank you. I thought perhaps she had a question.
Oh, there's somebody. Yes, there's Renan. You'll have to unmute Renana Cadden.
Okay, I thought that I had. Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Okay. Not to discount any of the work that Stacey Abrams and the other wonderful people did in Georgia, but I'm curious about two things. The nature of the two candidates that were opposing Ossoff and Warnock. I mean, it seemed to me, particularly that Kelly Loeffler was a very weak candidate and just ridiculous of the things that she said. And I understand too that David Perdue's campaign came out with anti-Semitic statements, and there were cartoons with John Ossoff with the big nose. How much did that figure into the wins of Warnock and Ossoff, the nature of the candidates that opposed them?
I think it's impossible to disentangle, you know, whether it's the effect Trump had on voter turnout or the weakness of the Republican candidates. You know, it was very interesting to watch David Perdue because, frankly, he was quite liked in Georgia by a lot of people. Now, he was not accessible. I wouldn't say Democrats liked him, but I would say there were folks who would have called themselves middle of the road who thought, okay, the guy's doing a pretty good job 2 years ago or a year ago. Once, you know, seeing how much he did Trump's bidding and how weak he became, and the sheer cowardice, frankly, that he showed by just turning into whoever he whoever he thought Trump wanted him to be. And especially when he made fun of the vice president's name. If you remember, he was at a rally, said Kamala Lala Lala, or whatever her name is. There was a huge movement, a very grassroots movement of people who have names that are uncommon, who were saying, what would he have said with my name? And that was actually a big effect that we saw on the ground of people saying, what about my name? I have a name like that. Kelly Loeffler, tremendously weak. And it's another reason why I look at 2022, when we will have a gubernatorial race and Warnock will be running for re-election. There are already Republicans who are being suggested as potential contenders, like Chris Carr, who is our young-ish attorney general in Georgia, also very well liked by many people, pretty, you know, nothing in his past, let's say, or at least nothing where we can argue about that. But, you know, we do hear of candidates who may run against Warnock who won't be as weak as Loeffler was. So it'll be interesting to watch. Evelyn, what do you think in terms of how we disentangle some of these things?
Well, as you were talking, I was thinking about the cases in the 2015 book. And, you know, as I get queried more and more often about this construct and presented with what ifs and different cases, I'm having to think quite systematically about, like, what's my criteria and what is specific to, or what do they share in common irrespective of office, whether you're running for the presidency, a governorship, or a mayoral campaign. And listening to you, I was thinking to myself, in each case, whether it was Chisholm, Jackson, Hillary Clinton, or Barack Obama, there's a degree in which misogyny is leveled, you know, and clearly expressed opposite the female candidates. And there are clear cases of sort of overt hate messaging and racism that is also invoked by the white opponents. So when you think about the campaigns themselves, each candidate, each historic first candidate, and whichever axis of identity presumably disadvantages them, it is often attacked by way of the opponent's campaign ads or their explicit way in which they try to exploit that as a weakness, presumably to instill fear and, let's say, white voters to, you know, try and rally a majority group to sort of abandon that candidate. And so again, you know, I'm almost daily, I'm queried about this thing, this concept. Even tomorrow, I'm gonna be talking at my alma mater about, and they've already sent me my questions in advance. And I really am having to think about, well, what if this? What if that? And as an academic, I start imagining sort of, here are the bullet points, you know, and here's the framework, and here are sort of the boundaries, or here's the criteria, and here's what I see as being consistent across cases, regardless of level of office, and even sort of the demographic group that may be mobilized or inspired.
Yeah.
And so just in listening to you, it helps me kind of flesh out the concept. And I also know, going back to one of the questions in the chat, that young people are inspired by these candidates as well. Young people uniformly are also energized by these candidates in a way that is really special, you know, where they take a very active role insofar as they work these campaigns. You know, they honestly, they canvass and they make phone calls, and they are really loyal grassroots supporters for these candidates.
Yeah.
Once you get young people on board, it's like, as they like to say, they are really rah or die for their candidate.
They're lit. So I want to add two things to what you said. One of them, I think maybe many of you saw the analysis of Warnock's puppy commercials. And the reason he used that puppy in his commercial was because Loeffler really worked to paint him as a scary Black man. And he kind of premeditated and acted in advance to dissipate any sense of that with his puppy commercials very, very effectively. And anyone who's met him knows he's like the softest, kindest, but like most passionate person. And so it was a very interesting strategic move, exactly to your point, Evelyn, of understanding, you know, this person is going to be racist. They're going to use tropes against me. They're going to try and turn white voters in the suburbs against me. No, here's what we're going to do. And we see effectively women have done that as well, you know, trying to kind of take the first step in mitigating any kind of misogyny. Also, you know, in terms of this idea of young voters, it's something that always, you know, it bothers me. I like data. And so I look at the data, and young people simply do not vote, as we know. This election, you know, we saw an increase in 2018. I can't remember the exact numbers, but I want to say people were saying, oh, the increase, we saw a 12% increase among millennials. Well, that meant it went from like 2.9% to like 4% or whatever it was. It was like 3 point something. So we do see an increase. Now in this past election, the percentage of voters who voted in the election, in the general and in the runoff, who were under the age of 50, and I say under 50 because that is a young voter here, was tremendous. And under 30 was even tremendous. I want to see whether those numbers are lasting, whether young people who come up when they have someone that they already admire in office will vote. Does it take, you know, what will it take in this country to raise young people so that by the age of 18, they want to vote no matter what? And I think that's a real challenge for us. And that is something, if our young people in Georgia voted at the rates that our old people in Georgia voted, there's absolutely no question that Georgia would be blue.
Okay. Thank you, Lindy.
I just wanted to add real fast in terms of
and
one
Jim
of the things
next
that's
to you.
Interesting about young voters is that's true globally. That young people will take to the streets, they'll protest, they'll organize social movements, but it doesn't correlate with turning out to the polls. And it's just interesting, it's true globally.
Yeah, one of the things is going to be Jim Wall next. And since I also speak German, Vol. But one of the things too that there were about 20 years ago, I was in a heated controversy against a real rabid neoconservative. And it was really fraught with everything from death threats against me. My mail had to be checked for plastic bombs. Jane was pregnant with Elijah at the time. And it was nasty. But one of the things, and there was, unfortunately, the Chronicle of Higher Education didn't behave well with it. And they tried to set me up in this very strange, indirect debate with this individual who was really crass. But one of the things that many people don't understand, and I ended up doing this, it was a funny situation because I also played piano and I could type 360 words a minute, 8 words a minute. So I was giving these detailed answers. It was done in a written form. And this guy was doing these crass insults like this. But one of the things many people don't realize is, paradoxically, and this is connected to what Jane and Lindy were just saying, actually young people love politics, but older people hate politics, but they actually are attracted to governing and rule. And many people don't know the distinction between rule and politics. Because you see, politics is more linked to speech. That's why the young people like going out in the streets, the protest. That's part of politics, the more vibrant, active part. But the other side, many young people find boring, unfortunately, which is fine, you gathered in the streets, but eventually you got to go home and you want a functioning society when you go home. And many older people are thinking about a functioning society. And one of the things that we really need is to get those two to meet. Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. And some of what Lindy was mentioning, and as she brought up the concrete levels, is about those meetings. And a lot of what Evelyn, she's talking not only about the symbolic point of galvanizing people, but at a very concrete level. We all want that moment. I often say, a lot of people think they have this belief that if you could get a big enough crowd, you could achieve anything. But what they forget is, no matter how big the crowd is, everybody's got to go home. Mm-hmm. And you want to go home to a functioning infrastructure, a society that works. Yeah. Anyway, Jim, you're on.
Yeah, thanks, Louis. And this might be related to the comment you just made, but this is a fascinating conversation. So thank you both, or thank all of you. But this connection, this chemistry between historic first candidates or symbolic candidates and the voters, that relationship is mediated by the political parties, right? A lot of time they're in between those two entities. And so I was wondering, Evelyn, in your scholarship and Lindy, in your experience, for better or for worse, what have you seen how political parties mediate that chemistry or that relationship, both positively and negatively, I suppose?
Well, it's interesting you asked that question, because when we study particularly Black female candidates, they're actually tapped or encouraged to run by their communities. It could be their church, oftentimes their sororities. You probably witnessed, the active role in which Kamala Harris's sorority, Alpha Kappa Alpha, played in sort of her campaign in endorsing her candidacy. And one critique leveled against the party system is how oftentimes they are reluctant to get behind particularly Black women candidates. And even it's not until they prove themselves to be a truly viable candidate, winning sort of the nomination via the vote from constituents and new voters, that then the party is sort of like a Johnny come lately to back the candidate. And so oftentimes, at least with regard to Black women who have been successful in historic first, and we saw many women of color via the 2018 midterm elections emerge as historic first, like the Squad, for example, case in point, being so heavily supported by their communities and civic organizations, and to a lesser extent being actively recruited. In the case of Johanna Hayes, the first Black woman to be elected to Congress from the state of Connecticut, she was in fact tapped, encouraged by Christopher Murphy to run. But still, I think she was not the pick of the Democratic Party when she initially ran, if I recall correctly. It wasn't until she secured the nomination via the vote that then the party got behind her. I think that's sort of her story in the state of Connecticut as one among those historic first candidates in 2018. So that's what comes to mind. I'd be real interested in Lindy and her take.
Well, I think, Evelyn, in my mind, it kind of depends at what level you're running for office. Because I think when we talk about federal politics, Warnock was clearly a top pick, and there was Matt Lieberman was another candidate running in the Democratic primary, and no matter how many people asked him to please step down, he wouldn't do it. And so, the party did play a role, I would say, in helping to shape that more nationalized race. But at the state level, I think we haven't had a very strong party. In fact, it's the biggest complaint that I hear from people. I think the party has worked extremely hard to strengthen over time, and certainly having a candidate like Stacey, really with Michelle Nunn and Jason Carter running in 2014, it kind of started to reinvigorate the Democratic Party. But Stacey running in 2018 really pushed things forward, and there was a huge, I think, $40 million injection into the state in terms of Democratic politics, which we hadn't had that kind of coordinated effort, and the party grew with that and after that. So when it comes to the support of the party in historic first, sometimes I see the party as more of a follower than a leader in that sense. And it takes the courage of these candidates to set the tone. Now we have Nikema Williams, who is the chair of the Georgia Democratic Party, first Black woman. I'm proud to call her a friend. I chaired her Women with Nikema campaign for Congress. She replaced Congressman Lewis. And she is the first Black woman to lead the Georgia Democratic Party. And it took until, I guess, she was elected in 2019 for that to happen. So that is an historic first, even within the party, that is almost following the historic first that we saw with Stacey as the nominee. So it's hard to know, the party, I think nationally is much more potentially organized or active in the selection of candidates or getting behind candidates, is more coordinated. But I would say there's a reticence at the local level and even the state level. Stacey will not get involved really in a campaign, even as a party leader here. She doesn't put her thumbs on the scales, and there's a lot of reasons for that. She obviously is not the Democratic Party, but we don't see the same kind of shaping that we might see at the federal level. And that could change as the party strengthens here. But I think there is a sense that we don't know what's coming with demographic changes, like let the people decide.
Well, this is a rich conversation. Thank you all. Thank you, Evelyn, for your work. And as you know, when people are really doing something that is really speaking on the pulse of reality, unfortunately, it's so sad, but a lot of the academy tends to hate reality. We're among those who actually understand that people have to live reality. And so I thank you for doing research that keeps on the pulse of reality. Lindy, it's so wonderful to have this moment with you. And I see from some of the comments that people are just enjoying and they're getting this ground level analysis. But there's this other element too. I can't help it when I look at the screen, because as you know, you and Jane are connected through the name Miller. And Jane is named after her paternal grandmother, Jane Miller. And so it's one of these situations through her father, John Komaroff. And so one of the things, we have to say, just for somebody who loves both of you so dearly, it's so wonderful to see you. I should add to that as well, as we are coming to a close. There's so many convergences as we talk about symbolic power and symbolic connections that it's hard to not think about. When I think about the fact that the first time there's a vice president who's functioning in the role, right, of the spouse is a Jewish man. He's an Ashkenazi Jewish man, and his wife is from a Jamaican background. Is also Tamil. One of the funny things is I'm Jewish, but I'm a Mizrahi Jew, but I'm also from Tamils and Jamaican. And so there are these strange ways that reality could speak to us, because it reminds us also, as Jane had said earlier, there are many kinds of Jews. And sometimes, I always say to people when they think about Jews, they think their Jews are the Jews. And they don't realize, you know, my background is Sephardic and Mizrahi, and yours is Ashkenazi, and there are many different backgrounds here. But it's a similar thing with Blacks. People think their Blacks are the Blacks. But, you know, I mean, there is nothing at all about Kamala Harris's Black identity that needs to be questioned in terms of her love for Howard, her love for the community. And I've seen her get, you know, break out in terms of her just love. She loves her Tamil and her African-American and her Afro-Jamaican background. And this is part of the complexity we need to embrace. When we think about democracy, it's not just about a bunch of people voting. It's also about a world in which we're able to understand what it is to meet together and communicate as human beings. And so I thank you all for this wonderful moment for us to do it. And I think right now, Jane Miller is very proud of seeing the next generation continue on, just as I know that Patricia Solomon, Edgar Solomon, that's my background, are thinking the same. And all those people from the Simiens, because I've learned a lot about Evelyn's background in Louisiana, what we understand is that it's up to us. And this is something in Judaism we know. A lot of people think that when we talk about what it is to be, I don't like the way people use chosen people. They don't understand what it means. It's an obligation to carry ethical life. And I see the way so many have risen to the occasion as really taking seriously that we always struggle for something greater than ourselves. And what I take from a lot of what you said, Lindy, is that in the end of the day, it's not about prediction and forecast. Ultimately, it's about commitment. And so I thank all of you for your commitment. Be well, be happy, be safe, and the struggle continues, and I'm happy we're doing it together. Good night, all.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you.
Thank you.
So nice.
Thank you. Excellent program. Thank you all. And thanks everyone for being here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay.